Hello, everybody. This is Cheryl Duffus, your QEP director, and right now I am making a video on creating and guiding peer review groups. Peer review groups are something that writing instructors encourage, and that means student groups, small groups of students who come together and they give each other feedback on their writing projects. And this sounds really great, but they can actually be a huge mess. Anytime you're working with small groups of students and giving them responsibilities, sometimes it doesn't really work out the way that you have intended. I myself, I've been teaching writing for 20 years now, and I have really struggled with peer review groups, getting students to give each other feedback. And I think most of the problem was just that I didn't really know how to structure it. I didn't know how to pick the groups and put them together. How to give them guidance so that they would be effective. And I think I've learned some things and done some research along the way that have made this more effective. So if you are also wondering how to do this, then you are in the right place. Let me just start this here from the beginning. All right. So if you're thinking of using peer review groups, then what might perhaps be some benefits of having students work in groups and provide feedback? For starters, it gives students a different type of feedback on their writing. We're told they need feedback and guidance throughout the writing process, and this is one way of doing it. And it helps students to mature and to develop some accountability and responsibility, perhaps even some leadership skills, especially for students who are strong writers, but they may not be the more talkative, extroverted people in the class. It gives them a chance to show their experience and their leadership capabilities in a smaller format where they might feel more comfortable talking. It also gives students the experience of getting feedback from someone besides an instructor, getting feedback from someone who's not giving them a grade, and the stakes are a little bit lower. They're also getting feedback from someone like themselves. They may be getting the feedback in a way that makes more sense to them because students communicate with one another probably better than I do with students. It also gives them feedback in terms of seeing other students writing, because sometimes we write in a vacuum. I mean, I never had peer review groups in college, and so I had no clue. Did other people write tons better than me? Did they write the same? Were they weaker? I mean, sometimes this gives students some perspective on their own writing. Oh, I'm not the only one who makes these mistakes. Whew, I'm not an idiot, which is what we sometimes think. Or, oh, hey, I do this thing really good and people like it and they respond to my writing in this way. So it can help build confidence for student writers. Now, of course, another big benefit too is that if students are getting feedback from students, that takes some pressure off of you, the instructor, to provide all the feedback, to be the sole source of everything. So it gets you kind of out of that parenting mode. Now, there are obvious drawbacks. The main drawback that I have run into is that sometimes students feel like they don't know what they're doing, or that they're not qualified to give each other feedback. I think the first thing to emphasize for students who are feeling anxious that they're not qualified, maybe they're thinking, I'm not the teacher, I'm not giving the grade, or I don't know anything about the student's topic, or maybe even I'm not a very good writer, who's going to listen to me? I emphasize that they're not giving advice as a teacher or even a writer or as an editor. They're giving feedback as a reader. So as a reader, just think of themselves, I'm just a reader. I'm just reading this, and I'm just telling the writer what works and what doesn't work for me as a reader. And I think that takes the pressure off of students, and it allows them to be in a place that is appropriate for them. Because good writing hopefully should communicate to everybody in your class. Y'all are all in the same class together. You're all studying the same things. You're all kind of on the same level. So just get them to see themselves, oh, I'm just reading and responding to where I understand and where I'm struggling. I'm also responding as a student who's working on the same assignment. And so as that student, I know what the assignment expectations are. So if I'm reading this and I'm saying, oh, hey, you left out this part of the assignment, or you didn't do this, or you did this, I think you might be doing this in a wrong way, then they can give feedback as a student with a similar sort of experience level. So reassure them that you know, they can do this and describe for them what their place is in this process. And I think that'll allay a lot of that anxiety. Another thing that you have to do is you have to plan it and you have to structure it. You know, you have to have a certain day, a certain amount of time. You have to give them guidance and as to how to do this and rules and all of that. You can't just say, hey, go read each other's stuff, and they'll spend 5 minutes doing it and then the rest of the time either texting or talking about something far more enjoyable than talking about writing. So you do have to plan it and manage it. Another problem that can come up are the students who completely slack and screw things up. And that is probably my biggest annoyance. The students who slack are the ones who show up, but they don't bring their own work. So let's say you're in a group of 3 students and they're each supposed to bring a draft and they're exchanging them. Then all of a sudden there's one person who hasn't brought something to read, and yet they need something to read. And so they're either sitting around doing nothing or they're kind of sharing with one other person. And it's just, these students really get on my nerves, and unless they have a good excuse, I give them a pretty heavy penalty for showing up for peer review without a draft. It's better to show up than to skip it, but I just don't like that. I feel like you're not holding up your responsibility to the other members of the class, and you know, it's like a job. I try to tell them that, you know, these are the things that are going to be expected of you in your workplace. Show up with your work, please, and don't be a drag on your fellow coworkers. So I would say build in something in the grade so that if they slack, then they're punished for it. And that, I think that's a frequent complaint I will hear from students in terms of group work or peer review work is, you know, well, I do my part and I don't see other people doing their part. But if the students know there's a grade penalty, then I don't know, they feel vindicated if they're not the ones slacking. So that would be my advice with that. And since I crack down pretty hard, I really don't have people who show up without their drafts. And you know, I'll send them back to their rooms to print, or I'll tell them to bring their computer. They don't have to necessarily bring a paper copy. So keep in mind that there are lots and lots of benefits, but you have to predict for those drawbacks and manage them ahead of time. So at the next point, once you've decided you wanted to work with these peer review groups, you have to think about, well, how am I going to put the students in the groups? And there are basically 2 ways. You pick, or the students pick. You can also do something in Blackboard where you have it randomly put students into groups, and then that way you're picking, but not really, because there's no bias by you, because you might know the students well in your class, and so you might be biased in how you put them together. So there's that strategy. You can number the roll and just put them together by numbers. You could also select students and put them together by strengths and weaknesses. It might be, I don't know, you might want to put a strong writer in with 2 weaker writers, because you don't want a group of 3 weaker writers working together, because they might not do as well as if they had a stronger one in the group. So you can think of different ways you might put together these writing groups. I think Turnitin will also randomly put them together in peer review groups if you select the peer review function. You can have students self-select. Usually they do this by the easiest way possible, which is whoever they're sitting next to. I really have not run into lots of problems with friends being too easy on each other. I suppose that could be something to think about in terms of students selecting their own groups. Also the problem of having weaker writers clustering together, if that happens to be where they're seated. Usually I have other tricks that will keep them from being too nice to one another. So the other good thing you can do once you have formed these groups is that you can use them as kind of writing support groups. And anytime you want students to do group work, you can just say, get into your writing groups. And that's a nice shorthand for, you know, working together in a group. And you can just use these throughout the semester in your classroom. And it's a nice way of building community as well. So you'll also want to keep in mind the logistics of how many drafts that students can read and respond to in the class time that you're allotted. So you'll want to think about how long these drafts are that they're bringing in. I mean, for a freshman composition class, I might say bring in 2 pages. Well, hey, if it's a 50 to 75 minute class, they can respond to a lot of drafts in that amount of class time. But if this is an upper level class, or if you have them bringing in a longer draft, then you might want to think about, well, how much work can the students realistically do in the time that I have allotted to them. Also keep in mind, you don't have to do peer review during class. You can ask them to do it outside of class. If you are worried about where am I going to fit this in, I've got a lot of content to cover, you can have them do this virtually outside of class. They can share documents on Google Drive or some other cloud sharing thing. They can exchange paper drafts with each other in class and then complete the peer review outside of class and turn it in for you. This does not have to take up class time if you are worried about content. You can have them do it on Turnitin. They can do peer review there, and I think you might even be able to just split them up into groups on Blackboard and do discussion groups there. So that's the other flip side to thinking about class time. They can, if you run out of time, they can finish it up outside of class, or they can completely do it outside of class. I think you also need to think about how you want students to share their work. I go back and forth. Sometimes I'm super picky and I really want them to bring in that paper copy. If that is something that's important to you, then you probably want to find a way to enable students to print before class. I'm very fortunate. Most of the time I'm teaching in Craig and there's a computer lab in the building. And even if there's a class in there, 90% of the time, no one cares if you go in and just print. So I give students, you know, I tell them to come early and I'll let them into the lab and they can print. If you don't care, or if your students really want to do it electronically, then again, you can have them peer review electronically by some of the ways I've already mentioned. In Google Drive, they can set up a folder and create a Google Doc and then share it with whoever they want to. It is private. You have to have a link or a password or whatever to see it. It's not just available anywhere, but they can share them in Google Drive. I think it's also good to encourage them to keep things in some kind of cloud storage system. They can share on Blackboard. They can also share on Turnitin if you want to do this electronically. You can even do the really old-fashioned thing. If they all bring their laptops or devices, they can just pass them around the class. There's really a lot of flexibility for this. One thing that you can think about, and I really like doing this, is blind peer review. And for this, they have to bring in a paper copy. And what they do is they leave their name off of it. So the person who wrote the paper does not have their name anywhere on it. And what I'll do is, in our classrooms, they sit together in pods of 4. And I'll collect up one pod and exchange it with another pod, and then they're peer reviewing papers and they don't know who wrote it, and it's not anyone who sat next to them. And that alleviates the social anxiety of, oh, I'm judging my peer and people might perceive me as harsh or a jerk or whatever, or, oh, I sit next to my best friend's significant other and I don't want to make them mad, or, you know, there's all kinds of social stuff that, you know, you as an instructor might not even be aware of that's going on in the classroom. And I think blind peer review just really is kind of an escape valve for a lot of the student anxiety over it, and some students may feel more confident and assertive. They do have to sign their name. When they do a peer review, they do need to sign their name because they do need to be accountable for what they write. I am adamantly, no one can write anything mean, like, you know, you stink as a writer, or anything hurtful like that. So you do have to have them sign their names and be accountable. The big hurdle to blind peer review is that it can be hard to pass the papers back if you don't remember what all the students' topics are. So you might look down and there's no name and you might not know who the topic is. So I don't know, you might want to have them number them or something like that. I'm sure that someone more clever than me can figure out what to do with that. But again, I've had lots of positive student feedback on blind peer review. They really enjoy doing it that way. And that's another way too, that if you do have students who sit, especially upper level students tend to do this, they'll sit like in groups of, you know, strong writers here and weaker writers there, and that's a way you can say, aha, I'm going to switch out these things, and weaker writers can see models of strong student writing, and the stronger writers can help the weaker writers. And I'll do this. I had a class once where there were about 4 people in it who worked in the writing center, and it was a gen ed class, and I was like, I'm going to use these people and they won't get paid for being writing consultants. All right, so again, you'll want to think about ahead of time, what's my strategy for forming these groups, and what are going to be the logistics around forming these groups. All right, as I said before, you can use peer review groups. You can just call them, it's your small group or it's your small writing group, and you can use this for any kind of peer feedback and discussion you want to do during the class. You could even do it around a content-based discussion question, or, hey, you know, come up with the 3 main ideas from the reading in 5 minutes and report back to the class. You can use these groups for whatever you want to, and I love them because Again, it takes the pressure off of me to do everything. And the students really are social creatures, and they love collaborating and talking to one another and asking each other questions. So you can use them in the writing process for informal peer feedback. You can use this during pre-writing or when they're forming their ideas, topic selection, anything where they just need, 5 to 10 minutes to bounce ideas off of each other or talk about things with each other. Again, you can use them as small group discussion, conversational. They can talk about writing ideas, writing problems. They can talk about research problems, anything you want to, because sometimes they'll talk to one another, but they would never talk about these things in front of 20 other students, or they would never tell you, the instructor. And you can say, okay, as a group, come up with 3 problems you are having finding sources. And then it's less personal for them, and it's less risky. Oh, sorry about that. Again, you can use them formally, and this is when students bring in a draft and they are reading, responding to a draft. Now, I have found with the formal stuff, again, you have to have student accountability. In my classes, you get a grade for everything you do in the class. It's kind of like, even if it's face-to-face, it's a lot like online instruction where you get a grade for everything you do because there's no other way to track participation in an online class. So they get credit points for coming to peer review, participating in peer review, and bringing a draft to peer review. And I also evaluate the quality of their peer review, and I also have accountability for them using the advice they got in peer review. So again, if you don't have student accountability here, participation is going to stink. So it's all about, for me, it's all about just making them responsible. Yep, and I've already talked about other ways small writing groups can be used. All right. Okay, so again, as I said, students are going to need guidance because you'll get them used to this idea of being a reader. I'm a reader, I'm not an editor, I'm not the judge, I'm not the teacher. So you'll get them comfortable with themselves as readers, but it also can be helpful if you provide models or if you do some norming with students. So with models, you could find a sample student essay. Of course, ideally, this would be a student essay from someone who has graduated, or at the very least, you would need to find someone who, isn't going to be in the class or doesn't know these students, maybe a year or 2 ahead. Remove their name, make it anonymous. If there's anything identifying this student, then please take it out. If it was, I don't know, some big summer research project that they, were on the web page for, then you might want to change some things about it so that they have anonymity. So you can take that sample student essay and you can model how to perform feedback. So you could, you yourself, okay, I'm going through this as a reader. Or you could ask 2 more experienced in the students, okay, go through this as readers and let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses. Here, you're going to want to make sure that students understand how to focus on higher order concerns versus lower order. Higher order and lower order are words from writing pedagogy, and higher order means, I don't know, the more important things about a work of writing. So does the student understand the assignment? It doesn't matter if it's perfectly written. If they don't understand the assignment and they're not accomplishing the goals of the assignment, it's going to get a terrible grade. Is the writing focused? Does it have a thesis? Is it doing what it's supposed to? Is it making the right kind of argument? Sometimes students, they're doing an argument that's more appropriate for a different type of class. So is it the appropriate type of writing? Is the writing organized? Does it have good transitions? Does it have lots of good details? If it's supposed to be using research, does it use research? Does it use the correct documentation? I mean, think about the big things that if the paper's not doing these things, it's going to get a bad grade. I tell students, you are not a line editor. I don't want you going through a draft and correcting all the grammatical mistakes, because that does not teach anyone how to be accountable for finding their mistakes and correcting them themselves. So accountability. So, no line editing, no focusing on lower order concerns. They can mention things that are big problems, like I've noticed you have a lot of subject-verb agreement problems. That's something you should go back and edit through. So feedback to students should empower them to do the editing for grammar and mechanics on their own. And instead, students, and even yourself, when you give feedback, you should focus on those bigger, higher order concerns. So with norming, you can give the class 3 to 4 sample student essays. You can ask them to get in their writing groups and evaluate the essays and rank them from worst to best. And they can provide justifications for their rankings and talk about, this is why we think this one is a good example, this is why this is a weaker one, etc. And you can give your own responses to these essays and how you might rank them and why. So that gives the students kind of a way to, you're modeling and showing them how to talk about student writing. You can also do something where, if you have time for this in class, you can ask students in their small groups, okay, give me an example of bad writing for this assignment, or give me an example of good writing. The bad writing can be very funny because you'll see a lot about what students consider to be good and bad writing if you ask them to do this. And then the class can talk about that. Why is this good writing? Why is this bad writing? You can also bring in a more polished professional writing sample. You could bring in something you have written. You could just bring in something from a published text or from a professional website or something like that. And you can talk about, okay, in terms of the criteria for writing of this class, how is this an example of good writing? I think here with the guidance, it's just a matter of giving them some way of understanding what is quote unquote good writing for this class, what are the writing expectations for this assignment and for this class, how can I talk about those expectations, and how can I give feedback about them. All right, so I'm a big believer in telling students how to actually do the peer review. So giving them not only models of the good and the bad writing, but how they're supposed to give feedback. So there are 3 general categories for this. One is called response-centered, one is called descriptive feedback, and one is called advice-centered. Response-centered is the hardest one to do. I'm starting with the hardest one first. I don't recommend doing this in a gen ed class at all. I don't really recommend doing this with early writers in your discipline. I have found senior English majors are really good at this, but that's because they've been doing it for 3 years. And even in a senior level class, if these students are new to peer reviewing and writing intensive, they may not feel confident in doing this. The catch with response-centered is that you cannot give any direct advice to the writer. You cannot directly tell them you have no thesis statement, or your organization is lousy, or I'm very confused by the sentence here. All a reader can do is say, this is how I'm responding to your writing. Here I'm feeling seeing this, here I'm feeling seeing that. They can use leading questions, but they can't avoid direct advice. So they could say something, you could say something like, is this the place where you think you want this paragraph? But you can't say, wait, you were talking about this point 2 pages ago. I'm confused seeing you come back to this 2 pages later. I don't think this is in the right place. You might want to check your organization. They can't be that direct. They have to use kind of leading, open-ended questions. This kind of feedback needs a lot of practice and modeling, and I have to tell you, I am not very good at it. It's been kind of a cornerstone of Writing Center philosophy. I think most students probably benefit from much more direct advice. So if you are going to do this type of feedback, I think you need to provide a lot of modeling of it. And I think you need to have some students provide an example in class of how to do it. Because again, there's no direct advice, you just use leading questions. I'm wondering right here if you might think about your thesis statement, and do you think that this is the focus? It's very hard to do. Now, where I find I'm more comfortable even with majors is something called descriptive feedback. Now, with descriptive feedback, I always like to make sure that there are 2 things happen. One is that before peer review begins, the writer can express their concerns before the reader begins. Now, you may not even want the reader to see this. In freshman comp, I say turn over your draft and write on the back the 3 things you're worried about. And don't let your reader see it, and the reader can look at it at the end and respond to it. But sometimes writers are worried about things that are not problems. All these students come in and they're worried about flow. They don't have any problems with flow. I don't know where they've heard this word flow. but they think that flow is a good thing. I'm like, well, your problem is you have no thesis statement, but they don't understand that. So I say, you know, let the writer express their concerns, but you may not want the reader to see them. So again, I just have the writer just write them on the back of a piece of paper. And I think that you also need to emphasize to the readers, they need to let the writer know what is working well. So I don't know, at minimum, they should be able to tell them something like, you picked a really good topic. I'm really engaged by this topic, or I can tell that you really like this topic, or you're really excited about this topic. And that goes for you too. If you're responding to student writing, you need to tell the student at least one good thing about their writing. And it can't be a lie because they'll know, but it can be something as simple as, I love this topic that you picked. I'm really interested in it. And that really isn't about their writing, but it is about their abilities to engage a reader, and it gives them confidence. So make sure that readers let the writer know what is working well, and that the writer has the time and space to talk about what they think is a problem. And again, you can even have them do this at homework if you don't want to waste time. Tell them, before you come to class, do these things. Now, descriptive feedback makes students do a lot of work, which I think is a good thing in life. It gives them questions and prompts that are more than giving yes or no answers. So when you get design, I'm going to give you examples in a minute, so don't worry. When you give questions, you need to use language from the rubric. You need to use terms from the assignment so that students are repeatedly hearing the same things. So a descriptive question or prompt is going to make the reader write down more feedback than a judgment question or prompt. When I was researching this, I discovered that I was asking a lot of judgment questions and prompts, which was one reason why my peer reviews were not as good as they could be. So for the writer, if they see readers describing their draft in different ways, then they've got to figure out, well, wait a minute, I'm not getting across a consistent message. Why not? And the writer can also see different points of view, which might further strengthen their argument. So an example of a judgment question is there a thesis statement? This is something that I used to do all the time. I'd say, is there a thesis statement? And they would write yes or no. And honestly, you know, you have no way of ascertaining from that whether or not the reader knows if there's a thesis statement or not. They could just write yes, but you're not asking them to prove it. Or is the thesis clear? That's a yes/no question. So you could instead, you could say in a descriptive way, in just one or two sentences, what position is the writer taking? And then they have to be able to restate the thesis statement. And you could ask them to mark the sentences where they think the thesis statement is in the draft. Judgment question, is the paper clearly organized? Yes, no. Instead, you could ask the reader, make an outline of the paper, paragraph by paragraph. You could even ask them, does this outline make sense? Is it logical? Does it flow? Show me, you know, where are there problems, if there are problems with the organization, where things don't seem to be in the correct order. Instead of asking if the writer uses evidence, list the kinds of evidence. Which ones are the strongest? Which ones are the weakest? In terms of strongest and weakest, usually we think of that as the most convincing, the least convincing. Instead of asking, oh, yikes, if the paper is clearly written, ask them to highlight in color or draw squiggles or somehow mark up the paper places where they had difficulty understanding what the writer was trying to communicate. So making them work, not letting them just go through and write yes, no in 5 minutes and then spend the rest of the time texting. You could also ask them, after reading the paper, do you agree or disagree with the author's position? Why or why not? Again, this is getting them to do more. It's to describe their feedback, to describe the effect the writer is having on them. And again, just modify any of this to fit your type of writing. You may not have an argument. Instead, it might be a more informational piece or report piece. So you could say, after reading this, do you have enough information to make an informed decision? Do you feel like you want to buy this? I mean, whatever it is you're doing in the writing. Instead of asking about if the audience is appropriate, describe the audience is written for. So what about this draft is signaling a particular audience? Are they using insider terminology that only an audience with a certain background would understand? Are they using appropriate, you know, this is where grammar mechanics can come into play. If there are lots of grammatical mistakes, that might be a signal that the writer really isn't thinking about their audience and it's not quite there yet for a professional audience or for the professor. And you can also ask them to describe the purpose of this writing. Why do you think you're reading this? You know, what purpose is it getting across to you? And if there isn't one, that's a huge problem. So again, I love this descriptive feedback. It makes people work. I love seeing students work. It just makes me really, warms my heart. And it's getting them to be more critical. It's getting them to be more critically engaged in something that they're reading. I think that's really important because there's just so much junk out there that they read and they watch and they listen to and they don't ask questions about. So again, this helps them to become more critical thinkers and more critical readers. This type of descriptive feedback, you don't have to have them do this in class. They can do this outside of class. You might need to model it in class, but you certainly can arrange this so that it's not taking up tons of your class time. Again, you'll have to have the students turn it in and check it. If you have them do it in class, you can walk around and just pick it up and look at it, and you can read it over and spot check it. I wouldn't say you need to read over these peer reviews and scrutinize every word, but you do need to make sure students are on track, they're not slacking, and that they understand, that they don't have any questions. So I like this descriptive feedback method, as you can tell. You can also do a third type of peer review, which is called advice-centered. And this is where students collaborate to create a joint review of a draft. And this happens sometimes in different professions. You'll get a sort of editorial board review of something. So you can have one pair of students exchange drafts with another pair of students. And then sometimes students working together, they can work better, they can be more critical. Two people will see things differently. And so you get the students together to write a joint review of each draft based on the rubric or based on the assignment criteria. So if you already have your rubric, here's how you're going to be graded. No secrets. Have the students use those criteria and evaluate the draft. So the catch, of course, is that you better make sure they understand that rubric before peer review and that they understand the assignment before that. So again, you'll have to remind them, identify at least 2 things you like about the draft, identify at least 2 things that are weak or ineffective, identify anything missing, and if you have a rubric, that functions as a checklist, and make 2 to 3 direct statements. Write a short paragraph recommending important changes. Now this is a kind of technique that I don't know, depending upon what profession you go into, it could be like a review of somebody's work. Here's the job you're doing, here's a performance review. Here's a performance review of your writing. I like to make time for students to talk to their peer reviewers and to ask questions. Now you can't do that with blind peer review, but anytime that they know the students who are doing the peer review, I think it's helpful for them to be able to talk and ask questions. And sometimes this gets on my nerves because I'm like, I'm wasting class time. But you know, as I said before, they're social creatures, and it can't hurt to follow up written advice with verbal advice. Be sure that they are writing down their advice and it's not just verbal, because then everybody forgets, because our memories are terrible now. We don't have any verbal or oral memory anymore. All right, so no matter what you do with peer review, do not let students focus on just editing and correcting grammar mechanics, because that's easy. That's what they've oftentimes been trained to think is good writing. Again, you need to make them focus on those higher order concerns. They need to, as I said before, just a minute ago, they need to balance written and verbal feedback. Don't let them do just one or the other unless you're doing the blind peer review. And I guess after the blind, well, I don't know, if you're constantly mixing up the groups, it might not hurt to let them talk to one another. Now, here's where I try to close that accountability loop. I make the writer do an informal written post-peer review of reflection. So what did this writer learn from the feedback, and how do they plan to address it in revision? So what advice did you get? How are you going to use it? And what did you do to contribute to your group? And they have to use this reflection in their cover letter to me, or their reflection letter to me with the final draft. So when you turn in this reflection letter with the final draft, you build in this accountability for each student's contribution to their peers and how they used peer review in their revision. Now I'm going to switch gears real quick to a cover letter. And I've got these up on Blackboard, don't worry. At least I think I did. Oh, this one's open. So up here, I have professional development videos and guiding peer review. And so I have this section in here with sample reflection letters. And then here's a reflection letter I've used for English 102. And I called it a cover letter here. I've since learned that cover letter, that term is kind of confusing to students, so I started calling it a reflection letter. So I make them with their final draft. They have to turn in a reflection letter that reflects on their writing process, which is what all the stuff here in the black color is. But in the red color here, I want them, right here at the red, I want them to identify stuff that they revised, and I want them to, and up above that, I want them to comment on how they contributed to their writing group and how feedback from the peers helped them revise. And this is part of their grade. This is part of the rubric. If they don't give me a reflection letter, they get a 0 on that part of the rubric. And for me, it usually takes them down a letter grade. I'm pretty darn serious about this stuff because I've been teaching composition for 20 years. You have to build in accountability, and that means you have to give a grade or no one will take you seriously. So that's how you can kind of close the loop on the accountability with peer review, is have them turn in a reflection letter and have them state how they contributed to the group and how they use that feedback. You might be asking what you do during peer review. I walk around and I observe groups. I make sure that people have their drafts because I'm mean, and I'll pick up feedback and read it informally and do spot checks. You could participate in peer review if you wanted to, especially if normally there are 3 people in a group and let's say someone has the flu, but they sent in their draft or something like that. You could participate, join in the group, however you think is appropriate. If you do participate in peer review, I would recommend going after all the students have participated, because you don't want your voice to drown out the others and to sway what they may or may not say. I'll ask students if they want me to participate. It's a good way that you can give feedback. If you're doing it in class, you don't have to take extra time outside of class. Alrighty. So I would say next steps, if you're thinking about peer review, is to think about what type of peer review would work best for your students and your assignments and your teaching style. You may say, hey, I love this response-centered feedback, and that may be your jam, and more power to you. If you are going to use that response-centered feedback, you're going to have to think about how you're going to help students understand it. Think about what kinds of questions you might want to use to help students with descriptive or advice-centered feedback. And yes, I just have a handout with questions. And if you have questions and concerns, then please get in touch with me. I'm C. Duffus at gardnerwebb.edu. You can come by and see me in Craig, 206B. Pick up the phone. It's 4409. Happy to talk to you. Now I'm going to get out of this PowerPoint and just show you the resources I have here on Blackboard. Again, this is under, if you go into the QEP Writing Connection Blackboard.org, and you go down our little left-hand navigation menu, Professional Development Videos Guiding Peer Review. This is where we are. PowerPoint that I just showed you on my screen is up there. There are some links to peer review. So creating effective peer review groups, NCTE, that's just the National Council of Teachers of English. Even if you're not an English teacher, you can use this. You can just adapt it for your class. And then NCTE group evaluation. This can help with accountability, evaluating the group, including the self, how each student participates. So there is that. I also have some sample reflection letters in here, formerly called cover letters. And I have this handout on higher order. Oh, I already opened this. I don't need to do it twice. Higher order concerns versus lower order concerns. And if you open this up, if you go down to page 2 here, it defines higher order concerns. Is there a draft? If not, what's the problem? Maybe the student doesn't understand the assignment. I don't know. You might need to go through it with them word by word. Is the draft incomplete? The idea is very underdeveloped. This is a much bigger problem than if it's beautifully written. Does the draft meet all the objectives of the assignment? Again, with me on my rubric, let's say you don't use MLA documentation. That's going to knock you down a lot. Doesn't matter if it's beautifully written. You're going to get a very bad grade if you use APA or nothing. Does the draft meet your minimum writing expectations? Now that's where a really terrible problem with writing is a higher order concern. You can't understand it. Thesis or focus, organization, and I've got lots of stuff here you all can read for yourselves. Transitions, development or use of details, and the audience. So those are big things. Those are the higher order concerns people in the writing biz call them. And then lower order concerns, style, repetitive words and phrases, grammar and mechanics. Those are things to worry about. Last, these are the things that we really need to encourage students to do for themselves. They need to start being held accountable for these things. That's a different video. So stay tuned. Alrighty, I hope you found this helpful. If you have ideas about things you would like to add, please let me know. I would be happy to add them. This is all a product of people sharing their ideas with me doing research, and just years of trial and error. Okay, I'm going to end this. Good luck to all of you with creating your own peer review.